All right, why don't we get started? First of all, welcome, and thank you for joining us this morning. My name's Eric Hofstein, and I'll be hosting and moderating this two-part program. As you probably know, the program is going to run today from 9 a.m. until 10:45, and we'll continue next Tuesday, September 22nd at the same time. I'm going to spend a few minutes this morning introducing the program and the specific topics we're going to cover today. When I first approached UJA with the idea for this program, we dreamed of gathering all of you together in a conference facility, engaging the different generations, both separately and together, in a variety of seminars, and having direct interaction between the speakers and the program participants. Of course, in light of the pandemic, we had to rethink how this program might be delivered. The result is this two-day program, and while I won't be able to cover all the topics we had hoped or in as much detail as we had hoped, I know this program will be useful to you and will leave you with some valuable insights as you go through your own succession planning exercise. The partnership between my firm, Fogler-Rubinoff, and UJA was a natural fit. My firm works with countless business owners, many of whom also support UJA and other charities. Our estates and tax group regularly counsels family business owners on their personal and business succession plans, and those plans often involve charitable gifts. Incorporating philanthropy in a succession plan has many benefits, both financial and personal, and you'll hear more about that today and during part 2 of this program next Tuesday. We've assembled a tremendous group of speakers for you. All of them are experts in their field. Their biographies are long and impressive and available by clicking on their photos in the email invitation which you used to register for this event. I'm very grateful to each of them for volunteering their time to speak today. I'd also like to recognize the efforts of the UJA staff who have helped make this event a reality despite the very challenging times we find ourselves in. Janice Benatar and I have worked together on this program since day one. Most recently, Brett Henry, Emily Krause, Marion Lupu, Sandra Sullivan-Keeley, and Mark Basman have each played critical roles, and many of them are online with us today. I'd also like to recognize the signature sponsor, Scotiabank, and the webinar sponsor, Wealth Insurance, and I thank them for their ongoing support. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce our first speakers, Ali Spinner and Brian Cohen, who will present a moderated panel discussion touching on estate freezes and other business succession planning strategies. Mark Halpern will then talk about incorporating philanthropy into your business plan and into the fabric of your family. We'll then hear from David Golda and Sarah Brown and Ellie Scheuchert, who will present a case study of their own experience bringing the next generation into the business fold and incorporating a non-family member. And wrapping up this morning, I'll talk about common pitfalls in business succession planning and how to avoid disputes. We've provided time for questions and answers immediately following most of the speakers. If you'd like to ask questions, you'll find a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. That button will open a dialog box where you can type your questions, and I'll put as many of your questions as time allows to the speakers. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first panel. Ali Spinner is a tax partner with the accounting firm Crowe Soberman and a member of that firm's management committee. Brian Cohen is a partner in the private client services group of the Gowlings Law Firm. I could honestly spend the next hour and a half reading you a list of the awards and professional recognitions that they've each achieved, but I'm sure you'd rather just hear from them yourselves. So Ali and Brian, thank you for joining us this morning. Let me make sure that you're both on. Excellent. Let's get started. I have the pleasure of moderating this panel, and so I've got a couple of questions that I want to put to you and ask you to comment on. First of all, Ali, let's start with you. Can you explain the basics of an estate freeze?
Absolutely, and good morning, everyone. Sure, so let's talk about, as you mentioned, the basics of an estate freeze. There's really two main benefits that we have to keep in mind when we talk about an estate freeze. One, of course, as I love, is tax planning, being the tax practitioner that I am. One, of course, is tax planning, but the other is to allow for succession planning to occur in an efficient way. We'll talk about both of them for a second. So at its most basic, an estate freeze allows the owner of a business to cap, freeze, or limit their value in a business at the current value today, while passing off the future growth to someone else, be it a future generation of children, perhaps a spouse, perhaps key management, other employees, a new buyer, all sorts of different people. But the key is capping our value that we own in the business today and giving the future value to someone else. And of course, in order to understand an estate freeze, we have to understand why it's to be able to pass that growth along. So number one, Canada has a tax system where in our lifetime, the unrealized gains in our assets are not taxed, the unrealized gains. Of course, those gains become realized and taxable either when we sell the asset or when we pass away and leave our assets to the next generation. At the time of the sale of the business or the death of the business owner, all of that pent-up taxation on the accrued gains within the business assets becomes taxable, and a large tax event can occur. So an estate freeze allows a mechanism that you can incorporate into your overall succession plan, where it allows the business owner to limit the amount of, the original business owner, I should say, to limit the amount of taxation that would otherwise be payable on either their death or on the sale of their business, but often in cases of an estate freeze, it's in terms of the amount of tax that would otherwise be payable on their death on the accrued gain. And of course, that future growth has been passed across to another generation. And given that we talked about in the concept of an estate freeze, that the value is capped, of course, if you use the rule of thumb that there's about 25% tax on a capital gain that's realized on death, if we've limited or capped out our value in our business, then of course the resulting tax on death will also be limited. It's important to note, well, what if we don't do an estate freeze? Well, if we don't do an estate freeze, and I'm a business owner, my value in the business will continue to rise over time and grow and grow and grow as the business value grows. And of course, the corresponding tax bill that would otherwise occur when I pass away would grow in succession with the growth in the business. So in a typical estate freeze and a typical situation, the current business owner would effectively exchange, or I should say a typical situation is where the business owner exchanges their existing shares of the business for what we call fixed value preference shares. So effectively, we look at the value of the business and what the business owner owns today, and we freeze that. We exchange the common shares that we owned into these fixed value frozen preference shares. Now, these preference shares, of course, may have a rate of return attached to them through a dividend stream. But the key is that these preference shares that we now own in our business, that we've exchanged as part of the freeze, will never rise in absolute value. Meaning if the business is worth $10 million today, and we freeze the value of the business today, those fixed value shares I receive on the estate freeze are always going to be worth $10 million, no more. And of course, once we've frozen the value of the business into those preferred shares, the common shares or growth shares to which the future growth is going to attract or grow are really not worth anything today. So those can be purchased by other family members, key management, outside parties for a very nominal amount. Because the key again is that all of the current value is pent up in those fixed value preferred shares. Now, we often see that the future growth of the business is frozen in favor of what we refer to as a discretionary family trust. And in many cases, we see that the business owner's children are all discretionary possible beneficiaries of this family trust. And that's often used in situations where there's a desire to multiply the $850,000 lifetime capital gains exemption amongst family members, the use of this discretionary family trust. It also allows what I refer to as maximum flexibility. The beauty of the family trust is that the business owner actually doesn't have to decide or set in stone today to whom they're freezing in favor of for about 21 years, the lifetime of the trust until there's a deemed realization. So often those family trusts are used for flexibility purposes to allow growth to accrue to a vehicle without setting in stone exactly who's going to get what at the end of the day.
Thanks, Ali. Brian, can you give me an example of when an estate freeze might not be an appropriate planning option for a family business?
So the estate freeze world and trusts, it's a quite interesting one, and you have to be very careful when you come into these planning worlds to make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons, actually. To say my friends have a trust or my friends did an estate freeze, I need one because I understand it'll help so much, probably isn't the right answer in all cases. Everything is individual, and unfortunately, sometimes my job is being the worst case scenario guy and saying it would have been great, but for instance, you're really too late. The growth has already happened in the company. You're 95 years old. The value of a deferral, of the freeze, as Ali hinted at, is really the deferral of tax is the real benefit of the estate freeze. So if there's no deferral that's actually going to be available because you're 95 or 120, spending the legal dollars to put a trust in place and to go through the estate freeze may not be the best of options. The other one, and I'll get into this probably a little further later on, is you're too early. You're a 25-year-old, you have $200,000 in the company, and you say, I want to freeze it for my newborn child and take myself out of the picture. Well, how are you going to live for all that time? So those are the simplest of times that it wouldn't be a good idea. The other ones are, you're going to sell the company. It's an operating entity. It's not a passive entity. Your kids aren't interested. And at some point, the maximum value you're going to get for that in the near future is a sale. And if you start bringing other shareholders into the mix, is that going to make the sale easier or harder down the line? So you have to look at what is your overarching plan. And if the sale may be 50 years down to an outside party, great. Maybe you can still look into an estate freeze. But if it's going to be in the near future to maximize the value while your widgets are extremely popular in the market, the estate freeze may not be the best option. Ali could speak to, there may be other benefits, capital gains exemption and so forth, if you can structure right. But you have to look at timing. What are you going to sell? When are you going to sell? Mm-hmm. The other time that it's really there is if you don't have a successor. Your estate plan, your succession plan should be done hand in hand with your tax planning. So if you don't see a successor down the line and you're not sure what's going to happen down the line, sometimes an estate freeze may be too soon and you have to wait to see how the world develops. A simple one that can develop pretty quickly, you know there's successors down the line. They're not your family, but in fact, you may be Canadian. All your family's American. Those successors, if you do an estate freeze today and you put common shares into those American hands of a Canadian company, you may actually end up causing more tax than you want to be paid than less tax. So the overarching picture has to be looked at and not just the, can I decrease the capital gains rate today so I pay more when I pass away 120 years from now?
I'd like to ask you though, if that's, I can understand how that may not be appropriate at all times. So what are some of the other considerations which you would typically discuss with clients when you're thinking about business succession planning?
So this is a large conversation that you need to have at the front end with the client. And it takes some time. And sometimes they say, are you trying to turn me off of the file? And the answer is no, I'm not trying to turn you off of the file. I'm just trying to make sure you're going into it with your eyes wide open. One of the worst things that I can do as a professional is undertake a transaction for a client that's not in their best interest, may not be the right fit wording, but may not be 100% what will effectively help their succession plan. And they come back and say, well, why did we do it like that? So you can unwind some things down the line, but you don't want to have to pay twice. You want to make sure people are going into it eyes wide open. So the first one that we talk about, and I hinted at it above, is the timing of the freeze. When is the best time to do it? It used to be that you could say, oh, the sweet spot maybe is around 50 because you're going to freeze it. The average lifespan, you say you get into your 70s, and then unfortunately maybe pass to the world beyond. And your kids would get the growth beyond that. People are living a lot longer now. And thankfully healthy into their 80s and 90s and 70 is the new 50 or whatever cliche you'd like to use. So when you do the freeze and you get those fixed value pref shares, have you set aside enough that you will live comfortably? You don't want to set up a situation where you will have to go to your children to ask for money. You can make yourself a beneficiary of the trust if that works, but then you have fiduciary obligations. So we run the numbers. And an easy one is, let's say when you freeze, you have a value of $5 million and you set a dividend rate on those fixed shares, which you can do and you should do. And let's say it's 6% is a nice dividend in this environment that we're working at. So $5 million you freeze, $6 million, 6% your maximum dividend, and that's $300,000 a year. Ali could probably tell you better than I. I think that's somewhere between $180,000, $200,000 after tax or something, depending what type of dividend you have. Is that enough to get you to where you want to go? Is that going to keep you, your spouse, your grandkids, if you're paying for their, for their vacations at summer camp too, is that going to keep you comfortable, or do you need more? Similarly, when you take that $300,000 out of the company and you're trying to get a successor in there, is that enough for the company to run? Are you going to hurt the company when you do it? So that's something that you have to look at, is what you plan to do down the line. So is there enough for you to live? Some other things, and I'm very conscious of the time here. Ali mentioned the 26% tax rate. I hope it stays there. I am a pessimist. We have a throne speech coming. Who knows what they're going to do? Guaranteed income, maybe we're all going to stay home. I don't know. But a lot of people are saying it's not going to be 26% for much longer. It's going to be about 33 to 40% on capital gains, because that's really the piece that's left. So maybe if you're doing a freeze today, you don't actually do a freeze. You do a transfer and recognize some of the gain if you have cash. So that's a conversation we're having with a lot of clients today. The last two that I'd like to point out is voting control, who's going to control it and how. And the final piece, and we can talk about other things if we have time, is when the kids come on or a trust comes on during an estate freeze time, that's the time you have the conversation with the kids as to what you want the company to look like going forward. This is where you have the conversation about the shareholders agreements. Who can receive the shares from their kids on their death? Who can be their estate trustees? Who can be their power of attorney for property? Because unfortunately, what I tell people, and you'll hear me say this at least one more time today, the planning may be expensive, but it's a heck of a lot cheaper than the litigation if you get into the fights down the line. I know Eric, being a litigator, wants the litigation, but I'd rather they pay the planning dollars at the front end and not pay the litigation dollars at the back end. And that's when you should look into it at this beginning. Get the kids on side. Don't just hand them common shares. Say, okay, now that you have the shares, here are the rules of the road. Let's talk about how we're going to play this out. So there's many more things, but I think at that point it's a good part to stop.
I did want to mention one, because I think it's on our list, and I think we have time for it, and it's worth the time. One thing that comes up, and I'm not a family law lawyer, but one thing that does come up very often, and it is important, is that I always tell my clients, I'm sure Brian you do as well, that if you're going to start freezing in favor of a family trust and give your kids, or freezing in favor of your children and whatever, we do have to consider at the time of the freeze what the implications are on family law purposes. And I always like them to make, I always recommend kind of my blanket recommendation, and then we talk about it in detail, is whether or not having children as part of a family trust means that your kids should have marriage contracts. We don't want there have to be a claim one day because one of the kids' marriages doesn't work out and they have a claim on the family business. And often when I talk about that, it's, whoa, I didn't even realize that could be a fallout or a consideration as a result of doing an estate freeze. Now, of course, there are certain ways to work around beyond the scope of today to kind of protect the family business from family law, but that is something important. When we start bringing more people on into the mix as a shareholder, we have to consider the family law.
It's even bigger than that, because people usually think about their kids. I don't want my kids, I don't want to go into their spouse if they should separate. I don't like their spouse because of whatever reason. They're a blonde instead of a brunette, whatever it may be. It's actually, if it's my business that I started and I built up and I'm looking at doing the estate freeze and I'm married at the time, and I assume everything's going to be great, and I freeze my assets and take back pref shares with a fixed value, and then I get divorced 10 years later, my spouse can take a run at that estate freeze, because when I did it and I exchanged my growth shares for frozen shares, there is an argument that says that I have affected my spouse's property rights by restricting the future growth and giving it to someone else. And they can attack not based on the value of my pref shares at the time of separation, but say that should be adjusted for the growth after the fact. So sometimes, and clients really hate hearing this one, especially in a second marriage scenario where you say to them, I think we should get your spouse to consent to this estate freeze. And they say, I'm sorry, what? From who? I'm like, well, I can't give that independent advice. You have to go out and get it separately. And I highly, highly recommend it. I've had people both do it, not do it. And I've had an estate freeze actually collapse because the spouse, when they went to speak to family counsel, said, I don't think that's the right thing to do at this point in time. So it's not just the kids, it's actually spouses. And I think later on we have some questions that get a little further into this as well.
Well, I want to go back to one of the things you mentioned earlier, and that was talking about this particular point in time. And obviously, as we know, with this COVID pandemic, there's been a very strong negative impact on many sectors of the economy. And Ali, let me ask you, does this economic impact that we're seeing now, does it reduce the market value of a company? And if it does that create a better or a worse, for that matter, opportunity to do an estate freeze?
So that's a great question. So as we've seen, some people have done very well in this environment and we've seen valuations rise. Unfortunately, in many circumstances, we've seen valuations fall and valuations fall of businesses. So for people who have what I would call a tax-driven motivation for an estate freeze, then it is absolutely an optimal time, unfortunately, in many cases, to consider either freezing a business, because valuations are in many cases at the lowest of the lows right now, either freezing the business or refreezing the business. And what I mean by that is, for example, let's assume we have a situation where a business was frozen a few years ago, 5 years ago, was frozen for $20 million. Fantastic. Fast forward, perhaps now because of the COVID pandemic or situation we're in, the business is now only worth $12 million. So that original owner, yes, you have freeze shares worth on paper $20 million, but if the business was liquidated, the assets were sold and money distributed, you'd only ever realize $12 million on the 20. So your shares are underwater. So in situations where, again, going through all the questions, am I worth enough money and all of that, if we feel, you know what, hey, I'm going to refreeze this business down at the $12 million number by effectively taking the preferred shares that I owned of the business that were worth 20 on paper and exchanging them for fresh preferred shares that are now going to be worth 12. We've now effectively, again, reduced the eventual tax on death down to what the current value of the business is today. And it's important to keep in mind that if we didn't do the refreeze, yes, the shares are underwater today, but as we hopefully watch the economy recover and these business valuations recover, we will fill the hole effectively on those original preferred shares. So again, if nothing's done, worth 20 million on paper, today the business is only worth 12, but over time, as we see the business start to pick up in value, those preferred shares will fill back up. And one day when the business is maybe worth $30 million, those preferred shares will have become worth again 20 million, with the growth common worth 10. So absolutely, this is a time we're seeing where we're engaging in conversations with our clients. All the business owners on this session should consider, is now the time to do it, simply because, again, if you're tax motivated, the value is so low. If you're looking at freezing in favor of to multiply the capital gains exemption amongst family members, now especially may be the time to do it, because we're hoping that the growth of the shares will happen in a point after the freeze.
Right, of course. I want to pivot a little bit away from the technical side of estate freezes and ask you, Brian, what are some of the issues or concerns that people might overlook when planning for succession of the family business?
So you're exactly right. There are a number of non-tax driven things. And this goes back to the statement that Ali started with. Estate planning, tax planning, succession planning are all hand in hand. So the estate freeze itself is a well-known and well-utilized planning tool. Other things have to obviously come along with it. We've talked about make sure you have enough money to survive. You don't want to have to go to your kids. They should do a number crunching activity, actually. Look at life expectancy and how and where do they want to live and what is that going to cost them. And it is expensive when you sit down and run those numbers, living at home with care, living out with care, taking care of the kids and so forth, so that you never have to go hand in hand, as I mentioned before. Another big one that comes into play at the time of the freeze that people should look at, a benefit is you can look at what the tax liability is and say, okay, if I was to pass away right after the freeze, here's what my liability now is. How am I funding that? And this goes into some other things that we're going to talk about later. Well, we won't be, but other panelists will talk about later today. If you know that number, it's a heck of a lot easier to plan for it and to get the right insurance, or if you've already sold your business, the assets in place to pay that tax down the line. And that's a big one, because you often see all of this in place, but the tax isn't set up in the will. And then you look at the shares of the company and say, well, does the tax come out of the company? Does the company have the ability to do that? And then it turns into a battle, especially if one kid is getting the company because they're the heir apparent, which is an excellent segue to my next point, which is how the heck do you equalize the other kids if they're not involved in the company? You have more than one child and only one of them is there. They probably don't want the other kids saying, can I have my money now? Can I have my pref shares redeemed out now? When am I getting paid? Especially when there's spouses on the other side, because whether they're shareholders or not, they're at the proverbial larger table, nudging about all of this going on. So if there's only one kid in the family that's going to be in the company, or two, how are you taking care of those other kids and set that up at the front end? Back to the shareholders agreement. How does that happen? The last piece,
Brian, if I could add there, not only how are you taking care of the kids that aren't in the business, but also, are you compensating the child that is taking care of the business? Are you paying them appropriately?
Yep.
Do they feel that they're working for free for the family members, or are they being paid a fair wage?
And when do you start giving them equity versus a salary, right? So they can see the benefit of their growth. And the final piece is, and we see this more and more, you've got to remember, first spouses, second spouses, it's very hard to get rid of support as an obligation. So people like using spousal trust for their pref shares and say income's going to flow up from there. Well, you have to watch who your trustees are to make sure that money flows. And you have to make sure that that spouse is aware of the plan, because if a second spouse or even a first spouse sees a spousal trust in place and has to rely on the kids to pay dividends, they could just elect under another piece of legislation under the Succession Law Reform Act to say, you know what, I don't want to take under the will. I don't want this family trust or spousal trust you put in place for me because I don't trust them to pay me. I want what I am entitled to under separation or divorce. I don't care where you get the money, and your whole corporate plan is in trouble, because if you have to all of a sudden find a lump sum support payment for a surviving spouse who was, let's give a bad case scenario, 35 years younger than you, that's a big number that could just cripple the company going forward. So again, it's a big picture plan, and that you should have all your advisors aware of what you're doing. That can be insurance, accounting, banking, legal. It's a big picture, but if you're going to do it right.
And Brian, I thank you for that, because that's exactly one of the subjects that I'm going to be speaking about later on this morning. So that's an excellent segue into that. But before we do that, of course, let me pivot again to Ali. You, of course, see this planning from a very different perspective on the accounting side. And so I wanted to ask you as well, similarly, what are some of the commonly overlooked considerations and issues that you see in your practice?
Sure. Although my answer is not very accounting related, but what I often see, or what I often talk about with clients, is consider, do the kids, if you're going to be bringing kids into the business, this is less of a tax consideration, more of just a life consideration. Consider, if you're going to bring kids into the business, is it important to have those kids work elsewhere first? Should they earn their stripes elsewhere before they come into the family business? Should they develop a whole bunch of, a wider variety of a skill set? I've seen situations where children are brought into a family business, and what happens if the family business goes sideways, and then in terms of, and there's not a business to support the family anymore. Are the kids well poised to re-enter into the workplace if they have to go and find a different job? Not that I ever like to look at a disaster situation, but I always think it's important to consider all different angles of it, and making sure we're not, I don't think any of us would ever force a kid into the business, but really step back and think, is this what's best for the child? Just because we created a successful business that we've run and it's been our passion, should we let our children find their own passions in life, as opposed to bringing them on in?
Well, we do have a couple of minutes left. And so in these last few minutes, I wanted to ask each of you for just one piece of advice from your own experience that you would give to the attendees who may be thinking about starting or revisiting some business succession plans. And why don't we start with you, Brian?
So I think overarching, it's a few cliched statements. Give yourself sufficient time to do it right. Get the valuation. People don't want to pay for valuation. Get it done. If you're going to do it right, because it leads to two good cliches that I always like my clients to think about when they try to do tax planning, estate planning, and so forth. Do not always let the tax tail wag the planning dog, firstly. And second, and I thank Ali for correcting my spelling on something last night, you should always remember that pigs get fat and hogs get slaughtered. So there are rules in place that are effective for tax planning. You don't have to be aggressive to have a successful tax plan. You can do it right and help your clients out very well, or help yourselves out very well, as the case may be.
Ali?
Sure. One piece of advice that I have, and again, that I discuss on a regular basis, is I really believe in communication amongst the family members. Sorry. Live feed, getting calls.
Someone's calling you right now with a file.
Yeah, exactly. New client wants to do an estate plan. It's always important to have communication, and I wouldn't go as far as saying free-flowing discussion and information, but I've worked with many families over the years, and I find that a good level of communication, transparency with the family is key. Whether it's part of the discussion of who's going to get what, who is the heir apparent, who's going to be active in the business, who's not. This is why we're doing a transaction this way. I find that communication and also explanation, it helps the family. Hopefully we end up with less people in litigation, which may mean less work for you, Eric, in certain circumstances, but hopefully doing the right type of work. So I'm just a fan of communication and information sharing and transparency to a point.
That's a fair point. And the reality is, of course, the litigators who work in this field, in the estates and trust field, they also tend to focus on resolving the disputes rather than flaming the fires and trying to keep people out of courts, because of course the devastating effect that can have on families doesn't help anyone. So
and I always tell my clients, you don't want to be the next article in Toronto Life,
right?
Because they'd love to have that article.
And that's not good for anyone. And so I think that those comments are all very well placed, because of course, a lot of the purpose of the programs that we're listening to today and next week are to help people avoid the very kinds of disputes that you've actually raised today. So I thank you for those comments. We do have a couple of questions from attendees. I think the first one, Ali, may be in your wheelhouse. One of the attendees asks, understanding that one of the primary benefits of an estate freeze is tax deferral, ideally of future growth to beneficiaries, doesn't the 21-year deemed disposition rule somewhat negate this main benefit? In other words, capital gain tax paid every 21 years. Can you comment on that?
Sure. So it's a great question. And the good news is that, so I mentioned before that using a trust can lead to flexibility. However, you're absolutely right. A trust traditionally will have a deemed disposition of its assets every 21 years. But as good planners, what we do is we make sure that in probably year 18, 19, 20 of the trust, we have discussions with the clients of, okay, it's now time to effectively transfer the assets, the growth shares of the business out to the next generation or whoever the beneficiaries of the trust were. And there is a tax deferred rollout allowed before the 21-year rules. I'm talking in very general terms, but effectively what will happen is before that 21st anniversary date, when we otherwise would have a deemed disposition, we will actually take those growth shares and pass them directly out, in this case, to the children of the business owner and say, okay, all my kids turned out to be good apples. I want to give them a third, a third, a third. I've got 3 kids. And you can actually transfer the shares into their direct hands without any taxation. And then, of course, the tax liability therefore has been pushed until the business is sold or until your children die, which hopefully is going to be many, many years after we die.
And just make sure at the front end that your trust is drafted in such a way that it's clear that that distribution is allowed, because essentially you're going to be cleaning out the trust at that point in time. And you don't want anyone to be able to say you're not allowed to distribute everything. You need to hold something back for other generations, because if you can't get it out of the trust, that 21-year window will hit. And so you've got to be sure that your trust is properly structured to do everything that you want at the back end and have all the authorities and powers that are necessary.
There's another question that's come in, and this one, Brian, I might direct this to you first. One of the questions, what are the challenges if the client changes their mind and it can't be unwound, the estate freeze, that is?
It really depends on the structure, what you did in the first instance. So if they change their mind and you've given the kids the common shares outright, so mom and dad freeze their shares, take the pref shares back that don't go up in value, and give their children the commons, you've got a bit of a problem at that point in time. Mom and dad can keep demanding dividends, maybe depending on the terms of their shares, but that may not give them enough. So to reverse that, you would actually need the kids to consent to do something with their shares, or have a shareholders agreement that allowed for you to back out. But very rarely does it have a clause that says you can reverse this, because there's probably some tax headaches that happen. The easiest way to build the safety valve, and it's actually quite common in today's day and age, is if the shares go into the trust that buys you that 21 years that we were just talking about, and the original transferor, i.e. mom and dad, are potential beneficiaries of that trust, you can build language into the trust that says we can distribute it back out to mom and dad, the common shares. So you can get them back in that way. But again, that goes to structuring your trust in such a way that that is effective. And then you just have to be really careful as to who your settlors of the trusts are and who the trustees and so on and so on. So it is possible to build backdoor safety stops, but that's really the best way to go about it. It just takes careful planning.
That sounds like a very complex exercise to go through.
Yeah.
Ali, do you have any comments on that from your perspective?
Yeah, I echo what Brian mentioned. And again, it's so important that we go through these series of conversations with the business owner as to why we're freezing, should we be freezing, what's the potential for the business. I have seen situations where it was actually real estate that was frozen in favor of children and grandchildren. And before you knew it, the real estate took off in value and you had kids and grandkids that were worth so much money, so much more money than was ever intended. I mean, it's great, but it wasn't exactly what they had intended. And it was a situation that we had to deal with at the end of the day. So I think, again, my discussion there is that careful planning with the necessary escape hatches that Brian was referring to are implemented as part of the plan, because you could potentially be stuck in a situation where if you've done something that you can't easily undo or perhaps undo at all.
We have just enough time for one last question, which has come in. And Brian, maybe I'll put this one to you. What types of alternatives to a freeze are used if there are U.S. citizen or residents or U.S. resident children involved?
You're ending on a nice, easy question.
Yeah.
It really goes to, with U.S. potential beneficiaries or shareholders. First and foremost, when you go speak to counsel and your accountant, make sure that they're aware of that, and you don't go through the transaction and then say, by the way, I know I told you we're all Canadians, but did I tell you that Jimmy just picked up a job with Intel down in California and he's going to be living there for the next 20 years?
Oh yeah, my son, we were doing residency in the States, and oh yeah, our kid was born there, but we moved back 2 weeks later, you know.
Right. Because the Americans are our tax system is expensive. The American system, with respect to them, I often refer to as just draconian as to how you get swept into it. So what can you do? If there's an American in the potential pipeline, one of the things that you can do is look at, first and foremost, do they want to be involved in business at all? Because if the answer is no, I would recommend you keep them out of the sphere of the corporate world and find a way to equalize them another way. Number two, from the front end, make sure you have U.S. counsel and U.S. accounting advice, which is where I was going at the first place. Third, you can look at, it may or may not work in the past, whether or not you can put assets, because you can't distribute to an American beneficiary out of a Canadian resident trust with that tax-deferred role that Ali was talking about earlier. Perhaps you can put it into a company that they control, and you can have limited liability companies and so forth. There are structures that we can set up with Americans in play that will help alleviate, not eliminate, but alleviate some of the penal type income provisions that they have. For instance, you can't just leave passive income in a Canadian company where you have a U.S. shareholder, or they add an interest charge to that when it comes out. Right. And you can't even leave money behind necessarily in a trust without an interest charge or penalty charge being added up. So it's a much more complex structure that has to be established from the front end. Or in an ideal world, before they get any money in their hands, the American government hates when you hear this, but get them to just give up their citizenship if they're willing to do that. Eric, you willing to do it?
Nope, not
there
yet.
You go. That's it. So it's a very complicated question that has to be looked at the front end with all the facts. Unfortunately, I can't give you a canned, simple answer to that.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And as you said, I know from personal experience, this question was not for me, although it certainly is one that's on my mind as well. And I have no doubt it's on a lot of people's minds. Guys, thank you both very much for your comments this morning. I will let you guys shut your videos off now, and we will we'll go right on to our next speaker. Mark Halpern is the next speaker. He's the CEO of Wealth Insurance, which is the webinar sponsor for this event. In his daily work, he provides insurance solutions to protect families and businesses, but Mark is also an industry leader and a highly sought after speaker, as many of you on the line will be already well aware, on the subject of philanthropy. Mark is currently the chair of the Professional Advisory Committee of the Jewish Foundation, and he's going to speak to us today about incorporating philanthropy into your business plan and also into the fabric of your family. Mark, take it away.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Eric, and welcome everybody. It's great. I hope that you can see that screen. Eric, is that good?
Yes, that is.
Good. Thank you. I don't want any technical difficulties. It's great to be here, and it's really such a delight to be able to showcase the work of the Jewish Foundation of Greater Toronto, which I think is one of our most treasured secrets that hopefully you're already involved with, or you'll be able to get involved with at some point in time. I'm going to be speaking today about incorporating philanthropy into your business plan, and I'm very excited about that because I've been involved in professional practice for almost 30 years, and I've been trying to convince people for almost 30 years that they're going to die or get sick one day, and they never believed me. And suddenly it took a global plague for people to realize that this is a distinct possibility. As a result, a lot of people are now getting their estate planning in order, making sure they have up-to-date wills and estate freezes and insurance. But one of those areas that for sure they're interested in is setting up something where they can create an enduring legacy for their family. Today I'm going to talk to you about that to hopefully get you into a situation to provide some great strategies for your family to also take advantage of this and gain the benefits. So a lot has changed in the last 20 years. In 2000, we had Steve Jobs, Bob Hope, and Johnny Cash. 20 years later, there's no jobs, no hope, and no cash. It's not that terrible, though. There is going to be a Crown speech coming up. Apparently, the tax department is going to be coming up with a new simplified one-page tax return with just one question for us. And how much did you make? Send it to us. Although it's tongue-in-cheek, the reality is we know that taxes are going up. And as a result, what we're talking about today is that much more important for our families. What does that reality look like? Taxes are definitely going to be going up. The government can't keep printing off money. We know that donations are down and donors are getting older. The legacy donors are sort of passing on. We're also in a misinformation age where people don't have access to all of the important tax information that we're speaking about or ways to structure gifts. We've all heard of the London Life advertisement for Freedom 55. Today, Freedom 55 is when your youngest child is 55. And that's not such a joke. You know, the kids coming out of school, trying to find jobs, being saddled with student loans, etc. We definitely have to take care of our families first before we look at the community. The good news is families are seeking meaning in their lives, certainly the millennials even more. And the neat thing is people are unaware of the facts that taxes can be converted into charity. So I'm hoping that I'm going to help everybody see that there's great ways for them to be philanthropic by converting taxes into charity. Now, my start in this business, it was actually 47 years ago. And that's when my father of blessed memory died of a heart attack at the age of 50. I bring this up because he was a busy engineer. Unfortunately, there wasn't a will. There was very little savings and there was no life insurance. It was very hard for us. Fast forward, I deal with some of the wealthiest families in Canada, and you would think they'd have everything all organized, but I would suggest 80% of the time it's not true. They're so busy looking after everybody else that when it comes to themselves, they have a lot of what I call old furniture for an architecture that doesn't look the same as it used to be. So I think the first point is that everyone has to look at things from a very comprehensive 30,000 feet up perspective and be able to incorporate some of the things on this list. And we're going to be focusing today on strategic philanthropy, and we'll come up with some great ideas that I think can really help you. The most important thing is this. My clients, at least the majority of them, have passed the place in their life that unless they were to invest all their money in a penny stock or they were to start spending their money in a very irresponsible way, chances are they're going to have more money when they die than what they have today. So really what they're doing is they're sitting on a lot of wealth as the custodian or trustee for the next generation. But what they're not aware of is the fact that they're also partnering with the tax department on that money. So part of this is not about investing, it's planning. Can we use some of that never spend money to preserve their estate for family or to incorporate philanthropy into their planning? And I think the challenge is that people don't realize how much taxes are payable. Here's just a basket of things that have taxes attached to them. And really in Ontario, it's very, very high. Registered assets are taxed at 54%. As Ali and Brian spoke, their capital gains taxes, corporate holdings, passive income, probate, the list goes on. So you can meet somebody who's worth $100 million, but when we do the work, we tell them that they're only worth $70 million. Suddenly that gets their attention because now we see that there's planning we can do to actually preserve that estate for their family or for charity. Now, all of us have three possible beneficiaries to our estate. We have family, we have the tax department, and we have charity. And each of us can only pick two. Which two would you pick? Most people would say they take family and charity. So with proper planning, you can be remembered for leaving a lot of money to charity as opposed to writing a big check to the tax department. On a very high level, again, for every $2 that you give to charity, you save approximately $1 of tax. So one idea is just changing your will and putting a bequest in your will, a certain percentage of your estate to charity or a certain dollar amount. Or if you have registered assets like RSPs or RIFs, you can go to your financial institution and get what's known as a multiple beneficiary form and go ahead and transfer some of that high taxed money to charities. So why is that? Because in Canada, the government unfortunately discriminates against singles, divorcees, and widows. If you don't have a spouse to roll everything over to your spouse on a spousal tax-free rollover basis, then everything is considered as if it's sold upon your death. So in this case, somebody who has a $2 million RIF, which is not unusual, 54% of that goes to the government. Wouldn't it be nicer to keep that money going to charity or including charity and your family with some planning so that it's part of an overall estate plan for yourself? We don't have a lot of tax shelters left in Canada, other than your principal residence, which again, they're changing that potentially. TFSAs, limited amount, and lottery winnings are also not taxed in Canada. Funny enough, I was with a lottery winning family on Friday that I was introduced to that won the lottery March. So that was my first lottery winning family. And the last one is life insurance. And that means with all other assets, there's somebody from the CRA waiting with their handout to have a percentage of whatever you've gained on your assets, except for these. And what I want to do is focus on some of the life insurance aspect to help you understand what it can do as opposed to what it is. So one thing is, you might consider donating a life insurance policy, and you might have an existing policy in part of your portfolio. It could be a $250,000, a $500,000, $1 million policy. If that's a permanent insurance policy, you can actually get that valued by an independent actuary, donate it to a charity or to your donor advised fund and get a charitable receipt for the fair market value of that, which would save you a lot of taxes. And then going forward, the premiums you pay would be considered charitable donations, and you get a receipt for that as well. So we have many situations where people have taken a policy that they didn't need, and we've created a lot of charity for it and saved them taxes. Or alternatively, maybe consider getting a new policy. So if somebody has, for instance, a $25 million estate tax, why not look at getting $50 million of insurance and donating that to your charity, wiping out your tax bill of $25 million, and now being remembered for giving $50 million to charity as opposed to $25 million to the tax department. Clearly, it has to be looked upon in terms of what that ROI is, or the internal rate of return. Or if you do have some insurance, why not just change the beneficiary to a certain percentage or a certain dollar amount to charity and reap the benefits of the tax savings? Here's for an idea for people who don't want to change anything. Just keep doing what you're doing. But as you'll see here on the left-hand side, this is a 60 and 58-year-old couple who have a corporation. And after corporate tax, they're putting away $100,000 into an investment for 15 years. So they're putting away $1.5 million at an interest rate of 4%. Because of corporate tax and passive tax, they that away at year 30, their family is only getting $1.5 million. Remember, they only put in $1.5 million. Here what we're doing is you're using tax-exempt insurance where we're saying, let's exempt $100,000 a year from tax every year. So for that, you'd have to buy an insurance policy for about $2.5 million, still putting away the same $1.5 million, but at the end of 30 years, having almost $4 million. So we've created over $2 million more money. So your kids are still getting what they were supposed to get, but now you have more money to give away to charity. And just to give you an idea, to take care of what the left side did to do on the right, that would be, you'd have to get a compounded return of about 10.8%. So you can see that's a very, very interesting way of accumulating money for charity. The three ways to fund insurance gifts, one is through cash flow. People don't like to cash flow, or they look at reallocating taxable assets into this tax-exempt asset, or another way is by using financing, immediate financing or premium financing. And that's just where you take an insurance policy, you put deposits into it, you use the policy as collateral to borrow against the cash value to put back into your business or back into your investments. Because you're borrowing to invest, you get to deduct the interest and some other ancillary charges. And now you've got an insurance policy in place plus your money. And at the end of the day, the insurance policy pays back the money that you borrowed, and the rest goes to your family or to charity. Here's an idea that I think is very, very important. We had a 70-year-old couple with a $5 million tax bill, and they had about $30 million in investments and equities, which they liked very much. And they were very charitable. So what we did was we took $500,000 a year for 10 years, and we acquired a $10 million joint last to die insurance policy. We then used that policy every year to borrow back $500,000 to reinvest in their portfolio. At death, the policy grew to $15 million, so the $5 million was paid back to the bank, and $10 million was left over that went to their charitable foundation, which offset their $5 million of tax. Now they're remembered for leaving $10 million to charity as opposed to $5 million to the government. So that is clearly a situation that people should look at as part of their planning. Now, here's something very important for anyone who has a donor-advised fund or a private foundation or is considering it. I would suggest 99% of the population doesn't know this. I'd suggest 9% of advisors, other than the people perhaps on our call, don't know about this as well. And that is, life insurance can be owned and paid for by a private foundation or a donor-advised fund. Let's see what that looks like in terms of incredible wealth creation for your family. And here's just a backup to show you how it can be done in terms from a tax point of view. So here are some strategies. We're not going to, because of time, we can't get into them all. I know that Saul Plenner is going to be speaking next year about donor-advised funds and flow-throughs, but there are a number of different strategies that, again, are bespoke for every individual in terms of what they can be doing. For the purpose of our call today, we're just going to be focusing on a couple of them. One of them is what we call Cpp Philanthropy. Everyone, when they turn 65, start receiving CPP in Canada. It works out to about $26,000 for a couple. If you're wealthy, you get taxed on that, and then you reinvest it and you get taxed again. If you're philanthropic, why not use that CPP? And you could acquire, a 65-year-old couple could acquire an insurance policy of almost $1.5 million. If they make the charity, their donor-advised fund, the owner and beneficiary of that policy, now they don't pay any tax on the $26,000 of CPP, and they've created a large gift. Alternatively, they can purchase that $1.4 million policy, and instead of the charity owning it now, make the charity the beneficiary upon their death, in which case their estate would save $700,000 of tax. Or perhaps make the policy available to your family and donate your registered assets, which I showed you earlier were taxed at 54%. So that's just one idea that I think would be very important to consider. Another is, if you are looking to create some transformational gifting, a lot of people look at insurance as, well, that's great, I have to die in order to be able to create money upon my death. But there are ways to actually create money for charities while you're alive. Here's an example of a couple, age 60 and 55, where we went ahead and they had a donor-advised fund with a community foundation, and we took out a policy for $10 million for them. The annual premium on that was $673,000. That's considered a charitable donation. So the real cost every year is only $336,000. They did that for 10 years. So really their net cost at the end of 10 years was only $3.36 million. But their death benefit at the end of the day had grown now to almost $13 million. So that's very nice and well and good. But these policies produce a dividend every year, and most of the time people don't take that dividend because you'd be taxed on it. Since the charity is the beneficiary and owner of it, you can now have the dividend paid to your donor-advised or charity every year. And as you can see in year 11, the dividend is almost $200,000. By age 89, it's $270,000. So during their lifetime, till age 90, they'll have distributed $1.5 million to charity. They'll still have a $12.5 million legacy gift, and the cost on that was only $3.3 million. So a great way to create money for charity. Here I just want to show you one case study. This was brought to me by another advisor where their clients had sold a business for $150 million and they had some insurance and they were philanthropic, and they asked me, what could we do to create some philanthropy? And this ties into the idea of the estate freeze that Ali and Brian were talking about. So here's a 61-year-old with $7.5 million of insurance. If he goes ahead and converts that to a permanent policy where the corporation donates that policy to charity, then the annual premium is $720,000. But you're paying that over 10 years, so that would be $7.2 million. But because it's a charitable donation, the tax benefit is $3.6 million. So the net cost is $3.6 million, and that policy actually grows and is a $14 million gift to charity. So very nice. For $3.5 million and tax savings, they were able to give $14 million to charity. Or alternatively, they could leave the policy upon their death, where the policy goes $14 million to charity, which now would save their estate $7.2 million of taxes. So the present value cost in that would be $3 million, and the cash received by the charity, again, would be $14 million. But this is the one I wanted to talk to you about because it really ties into the estate freeze. They did an estate freeze, and basically the final capital gain tax based on $28 million would result in a tax of $7.6 million. We did a private company share donation plan involving insurance where we donated $14 million to charity, which generated a $7 million tax savings. So instead of the family having a $7 million tax bill, their tax bill has now been reduced to only $445,000. And that's really a lovely thing to do. But here's the other thing. Life insurance is a special type of instrument that, if it's done corporately, provides a tax-free capital dividend, which in this case, the children and grandchildren can take out of the company on a tax-free basis. So we've reduced their taxes from $7.6 million to $445. We created a gift for $14 million, and we created a tax-free gift or tax-free dividend that could come out to the next of kin. How do you fund that? Well, if they would have set up a sinking fund, it would cost them about $6.5 million. But again, using financing, which is what we showed you before, in this case, the cost was only $2 million for all that we just showed you. So again, it is definitely something to consider for your planning. I've noticed that there are 4 types of givers. One type wants to be completely anonymous. So they don't want anyone to know about the work that they're doing, and they don't want their name anywhere. Another wants to give to set an example for others to give. Or a third wants to do it by doing it in order to be remembered for a school, a university, a hospital, etc. Or there are others who do it because they want to raise their personal or business profile. We find that business owners in particular, people like to deal with businesses that are philanthropic. And it's a great way to build out your profile. And again, you don't have to be Bill Gates or Warren Buffett in order to be philanthropic. I just want to end up that in my case, what I find is that there's an emotional component to what we're discussing. So if I asked everybody on this call, can you name your grandparents? I'm sure all of you know your grandparents, but how many of you know the names of your great-grandparents? This is actually a picture of my great-grandparents, Aaron and Liba Gross, in 1934 in Poland, unfortunately before they were killed in the Holocaust. Imagine if on January the 1st, you received an envelope in the mail, and inside there was a check for $10,000 from your great-grandparent. You think you'd remember their name? So there's ways with your planning to be able to create this type of legacy for your children and your grandchildren. They say that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. That's when the weather conditions are perfect. But if there's a storm outside and the weather is very bad, that apple falls far from the tree. And if there's a tsunami like there is right now, the apple doesn't even know that it came from a tree. Incorporating philanthropy into your family, into your business, is a way to pass on the values and the legacies that you want to your children. And let's face it, it can either be through religion, or I feel philanthropy is right up there as well, in order to be able to make a big difference and create a legacy for our families. We're on the cusp right now of Rosh Hashanah, which is coming up on Friday night. And they say that there are three things that will protect us and give us a good year. One is prayer, another is repentance, teshuvah, and the third is charity. So I think it's very important that people consider, how can we incorporate philanthropy into our business, into our family planning, in order to ensure that our families and our communities are really looked after, especially when there's such a need more than ever. So as far as next steps, certainly consider your own family legacy. Sit down and have a conversation with your family. Speak to Janice Banatar at Jewish Foundation. She's a tremendous resource and can help. Or also, you can watch my TED Talk. I did a TED Talk last year at Moses Neimer's Idea City, and it was in the disruptors category, and the topic was called the New Philanthropy. Please Google it and watch it. It'll give you more ideas to framework. Contact your advisor. Speak to them about that. Or call us. We like to collaborate with other professional advisors to make sure some of these programs can be done. And then we have a whole bunch of one-pagers and tax letters that go into more detail on some of these ideas that I think would be great, and learn about it. But the one thing I suggest is don't ignore it. There's just too much on the line and too much responsibility that we all have to really be the purveyors and the people who are keeping our community going for many, many years to come. If you have any questions at all, I'm always available. And I want to thank everybody very much and wish you all a tremendous Shana Tova, sweet New Year.
Thank you, Mark.
Eric?
That was wonderful. I appreciate it. I wanted to let people know as well, we've had just a couple of questions about this, that Mark's slides will be available. We will provide copies of any materials that the speakers use to the attendees. So with that, Mark, I will thank you for your comments, and I will we'll move on to the next panel now. Now, this is a bit of a unique one. When it comes to business succession planning, there's, as you can imagine, a great deal to be learned from those who have already lived through it themselves. And it's in that vein that we thought it would be useful to show you a case study to help you learn from the experience of others. The team at Algie Brown and Associates provide a broad range of services, which include developing a financial plan, protecting family and business interests through insurance, fulfilling philanthropic goals, of course, and organizing benefits plans. And they are a family business that has brought multiple generations into the fold and incorporated non-family members into the business. And here to talk about their experiences are David Brown, Golda Brown, Sarah Brown, and Ellie Scheuret. And I'll just ask them to join us and unmute yourselves and take it away.
Thank you, Eric. As a firm of estate and financial planners who over decades have worked with dozens of business families on their intergenerational wealth transfer and succession plans, you likely would think that designing and implementing our own succession plan would have been a simple task. We quickly realized, however, that nothing could have been further from the truth, as we learned to overcome the challenges that resulted in our own succession plan. Today, we are proud to be here to share our story with you. The story started in the mid-40s when Algie Brown, Zichrono Livracha, recently discharged from the Army, decided he would enter into the life insurance business. He needed to help support his widowed mother and 8 siblings, as well as his own family. At the top of the list in determining his occupation was the ability to be his own boss and work his own schedule. As an observant Jew, not having to work on Shabbat and the Jewish holidays was critical to him. As our dad got older, he began thinking about succession. I'm not sure if he did so consciously, but likely so. What he did emphasize to Golda and me was not to assume that this business was automatically ours, or that we were automatically suited for the business. As Golda and I showed interest in the business, Dad gradually went on more holidays and spent more time with Mom, allowing us to make business decisions on our own, some right and some wrong. It must have been difficult for him to watch and allow us to forge our own way in evolving the firm. It is a challenge that I personally face as I realize that nothing remains static and that a new partner will bring new creative ideas and strategies that are fresh and exciting. The challenge is to learn when and how to share control. When the time came to discuss the next step in our succession plan, Dad, Golda, and I sat down to discuss the options. One of which was to sell our firm to another company or to seek out a successor. At that time, our children were either too young to decide if they were interested in the firm, or they had already chosen their occupations. We decided to take the route of seeking out someone who had experience in the industry and who would have the same morals, culture, and belief as our founder. It was a daunting task, but we were successful. In addition, today, I am very pleased that Sarah is also being groomed and trained in a role as a future partner. The immense challenge that our new partner, Ellie, would be integrating into our culture and business processes. After 75 years, the identity of the firm was solid, and we were fixated on how we did things. Our staff was protective of our clients and of us. Their devotion had to be earned by the new kid on the block. Our trusted relationships with our clients somehow had to be transferred to him. We also had to feel comfortable transferring that client's trust from us to Ellie. This challenge in any succession plan should not be minimalized. Trust is truly the key. Ellie, Golda, and Sarah will share with you their story and experiences. From my experience and perspective, I can say that I'm a very lucky business partner. I've worked my life together with my family. I have engaged with some of the brightest advisors and clients in the country. And I learn every day from my partners, from my family, from our staff, and from our clients. The biggest challenges in a succession plan are keeping communication open, respecting the opinions of others, and the ability to stand by and watch your partners grow and flourish in their own way. Thank you very much.
Our dad, Algie Brown, was a wonderful mentor. He made succession look incredibly easy. What David and I discovered is that succession process has its challenges, and it certainly is not seamless. What we originally did not know were all the steps that would be required to achieve success. David and I had developed over the years a rhythm working together. Our combined unique abilities created an excellent outcome for clients and for our staff. Our process working together was smooth, but it had taken years for that to develop. What we did not realize and did not appreciate was the amount of time it would take to successfully have Ellie on board as our partner. Our firm was always about creating relationships and maintaining relationships with our clients. And relationships require time. Relationships require trust. Our clients knew we would do the best for them, and we would be there for them in both good times and bad times. But the challenge became how to effectively communicate to our clients and to our staff, both of whom have shared decades of history with us, that our culture would not change and that Ellie would only enhance what was created nearly 80 years ago. We had to communicate to our clients that Ellie would be there for them, and he would also be there for their next generation, that he would make sure that the promises made by our client to our clients would happen in the future. We also faced another succession challenge. We required more frequent partner meetings, and making time to stop and have these meetings was truly a challenge. We took out our calendars and we blocked out meetings for the entire year. We treated these meetings with the same respect as a client meeting. It also became apparent to us that the off-site meetings worked much more successfully than trying to do them in office. Part of our future succession plan down the road was Sarah Brown, David's eldest daughter. Sarah Zadie once called me into his office actually, and delivered this message. You are amazing at what you have accomplished here, but mark my words, one day Sarah will accomplish even more. Be patient with her, work with her, and watch the results. The challenge of succession is to be able to look towards the future. It's important not to lose sight of the past, and it's very important to work closely, honestly, and openly with your successor. It is an ongoing process, but when the successor is the perfect fit, the outcome is worth both the time and all the effort. Thanks. Okay. Eric, who's on next?
Why don't we go to Ellie?
Okay, perfect. Ellie?
Morning, everyone. Succession is a big word. In fact, in the first 15 years that I was in business, I hadn't really thought about succession at all. However, the next 5 years, there was nothing but succession on my mind day and night. And I thought about it constantly. Let me explain. In 2010, I met Uja Brown of blessed memory, together with David and Golda at a conference in Vancouver. We started chatting, and Uja invited me to come to the office once we get back to Toronto to continue our conversation. Little did I know that the conversation back in Toronto would turn into an interview, and then another and another. Although I knew the Browns casually prior to that, our paths had not really crossed in a significant way. Yet now, we were now on the path of discussing their succession plan, and I was clearly part of it. So as we discuss succession planning, I want to share with you some of the key issues that we encountered as we went through the plan, and what I would deem to be the keys to a successful succession plan. We do not have enough time to go through all the legal, tax, accounting sides of a succession plan. However, based on my personal experience, I will share with you some of the highlights of what you should be careful of when starting to implement your own plan. The keys to me are time, family communication, and trust. These are the key ingredients to a successful succession plan. First and foremost, if you have succession planning on your mind, the best time to start that is yesterday. It's like planting an oak tree. It takes a long time to come to fruition. You need to give yourself time, and lots of it. In our circumstance, we knew notionally by 2011 that we were moving down this path, and I would be joining Uja Brown & Associates. It took me a year to move into the office to join the firm, and another 4 years until we were able to paper the deal. There's legal work, agreements, valuations, all of that takes lots of time, and it can be extremely frustrating to all parties involved. So I would strongly suggest and recommend that you start working on that sooner rather than later. It's also crucial when starting to formalize a plan that everyone in the plan has full family support, both the successor as well as the owners of the business. I cannot reiterate this enough. A succession plan is stressful enough. Bringing family strife into it is way more than what you need on your plate. You need to make sure that your family is on board with this. If you're the owners of the business, speak with your spouse, and if necessary, with your children. You will save yourself a whole lot of angst and anxiety. In many situations, your spouse or your children may not be supportive of a non-family member coming into the family business. Fortunately, in our situation, that was not the case, but it's something that you need to put on the table early on in the planning process. Remember, often the rest of your family has been in the background supporting the business owners, and they may have unexpected emotions that are tied to the family business. So communication with your family is key. Now, in my mind, the most crucial factor in being able to get the deal done is trust. If you do not have trust between all the parties involved, it can make it exceedingly difficult to get to the finish line. It is imperative that there be open communication between the successor and the current owner. If you don't have a trust relationship, often what can be thoughts of hidden agendas will lurk at the surface. You want to make sure that when you're having discussions, everything is what you think it is, and you have full and open communication, especially if the successor will have an ongoing working relationship with the owners once the transaction is done. It will make life so much easier if you have a full and trusting relationship. So it goes without saying that if you have trust, it is so much easier not to sweat the small stuff. One of my valuators from Fuller Landau or Ron Garburn once told me, don't worry about the small stuff. Don't worry if it costs you a couple dollars more or a couple dollars less. In the big scheme of things, having a successful transaction is more important than anything. So at the end of the day, what you want to do is you want to make sure that all of your communication and everything that you do is pointing you to achieving your final goal, which is a successful succession plan.
Sarah?
I've been told many times that I'm blessed to have a family business to go into, and I agree. Today, however, we're here to speak about some of the challenges with it. Our family business, like many I'm sure, is part of our DNA. So when I started to seriously consider if this was a professional path I wanted to choose, I called my Aunt Gold and I asked her, should I join? Her response was that I needed to discover for myself whether or not this is something for which I shared the same passion as my Zadie, my father, and my aunt. She said, it's not whether you can take the job, it's whether you want to. Here are some challenges and lessons that have had a huge impact on me thus far. Don't try to start at the top. I started as a receptionist and I really liked it. In this role, I met important contacts in the industry and every client who walked through the door. I took this position seriously, emulating the caring and intelligent staff around me. This demonstrated to my colleagues that I cared to learn everything about the business from the ground up. Foster teamwork among the incoming stewards. After the reception desk, I pursued my life insurance license. At that time, my Zadie father and aunt had the foresight that I should be working with Ellie, who was transitioning to partner as his executive assistant. At the same time, I started bringing a new generation of clients into the office. I was scared about how this would affect my personal relationships, but Golda taught me something which I will always remember. If you are truly passionate about the benefit of what you are recommending, the fact that you genuinely care will shine through. Nonetheless, I had to deal with failures and complicated situations. As an experienced professional in the business, Ellie helped me navigate these situations. Joining a family business doesn't entitle you to a free pass. In my case, I'm the third generation in a well-established, successful business. Finding my unique ability so I could effectively contribute was a challenge. It took time and patience, but I realized that my unique ability is forging relationships with new clients, including the next generation for our existing client base, and strengthening those relationships with our current clients. Mentorship is essential to the succession plan. As a newcomer to the business, I had a lot of questions, and I still do. However, I felt very often that I didn't want to bother Ellie and David. Part of our succession plan defines Golda's role as a mentor to the next generation. She's been involved in helping me navigate day-to-day situations and providing indispensable advice. A supportive spouse makes a world of difference. That's true with any ambition in life, but I would tell anyone thinking of entering a family business that it is impossible without a spouse who is just as committed as you are to making it work. Legacy through shared values. Overcoming my fears that a non-family member could step in as partner and flourish was largely alleviated by my Zadie. He never wavered in his belief that Ellie's values were ours as well, and that the clients would be well cared for. In witnessing how Ellie deals with clients and runs the business, I've come to learn that my Zadie was right. I believe that so long as the incoming stewards of the business perpetuate the values and consistency of the outgoing stewards, the third generation contributes to the legacy and goodwill of the business. In addition to what you would expect a millennial to contribute, tech savviness, exposure to the cutting edge of thought and insight, my contribution will ensure that we continue to play an important role in the well-being of your family for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all four of you. I'm sorry that David wasn't able to get his audio working to finish his presentation, but I do want to thank all four of you for participating and sharing with us your insights. What I'll ask you to do now is turn off your videos, and we will move on, and that brings it to me, of course. I now have the task of following all of these great speakers and speaking about some of the common pitfalls in business succession planning and how to avoid disputes. What I should probably start by doing is introducing myself. You've heard a little bit of that from Brian earlier today. I'm a partner at Fogler Rubinoff's Litigation and Trust and Estates departments, which is to say I'm a litigator, so I tend to see business plans when things have gone wrong and a dispute has arisen. My role is to help clients find a solution to their disputes and, when needed, to argue their cases in court. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today are some of the common disputes that I see and how you might avoid them when doing your business planning. One of the most common problems that I see are rooted in the choice of estate trustee. The estate trustee, of course, if you're not already familiar with this, is the person who's responsible for administering your estate. They are required to follow the instructions that are set out in your will if you have one, and of course we recommend that you do, and they have to act in accordance with applicable law. When you think about the characteristics you'd want in an estate trustee, most people will think about honesty, integrity, fairness, accountability, maybe even good business sense. But many people also think about having certain representation within the ranks of the estate trustees. And this is especially true where the estate includes shares of a corporation or a family business. For example, you might think about what would happen if you were to die before your spouse. In that case, you might want your spouse to be one of your estate trustees so that they're part of any decisions about your assets. You might even give them a deciding vote if you have multiple estate trustees and you want your spouse to have some authority to make final decisions about the estate assets. If you're concerned about your business, you might want a business partner or a child who's been involved in the business to be one of your estate trustees. It's a common thing to see. Or maybe you want your children to administer your estate, but none of them have the experience or the business savvy to deal with the family business, and you want maybe a trusted lawyer or accountant to supervise them or be involved somehow. These are all the right thought processes, but it's important to think of how these arrangements can go wrong and to plan around them. And I'm going to talk about 3 different situations that I commonly see giving rise to problems in estate administration. One is going to be what happens when you have second or subsequent marriages and what happens to the interaction between family members. And Brian earlier this morning touched on this. I'm also going to talk about conflicts of interest. And the third common situation that I'm going to talk about are income considerations and lack of liquidity in the estate planning. So let's start with the interaction between family members in a blended family. In my practice, I come across this all the time. In a typical example, a husband has divorced and remarried and has children from his first marriage. He wants to take advantage of tax benefits of a spousal trust, and so he leaves the bulk of his estate in a qualifying spousal trust with a gift over to his children. What this means is that his assets are held in trust for his second wife. Throughout her lifetime, she gets to enjoy the income from those assets. The trustees invest the assets, and only the second wife is entitled to the annual income. Upon the second wife's death, whatever is left over, whatever capital remains in the trust, is distributed to the children of the husband's first marriage. And I see this all the time. In this typical example, the trustees of the spousal trust might include the second wife and one or more of the children from the first marriage. In theory, this ensures that the trust will be administered fairly, with the second wife having an interest in the trust, generating as much income as possible, and the children having an interest in preserving the capital of the trust, the value of the underlying capital, which they will ultimately inherit. The problem that I often see is that while everyone might get along, while the husband in my example is alive and holding the family together, once he's gone, the relationship between the second wife and the children of the first marriage breaks down. And even though I've used the deceased husband in my example, this also happens in the case of a wife who wants to use her wealth to support her husband after her death, her second husband after her death. And the Ontario courts have in fact seen some very well-known cases, at least in legal circles, which center around that very scenario. So it's certainly not exclusive to husbands doing estate planning for second wives, but on the flip side as well. So coming back to my example, you now have a trust which is being administered by people who no longer have any real relationship with each other. The second wife has to ask permission and has to sometimes curry favor with the children of the first marriage, who are her co-trustees, every time she wants a capital encroachment, every time she wants to access some of the capital. When might this come up? Well, maybe if she wants to take a big vacation, or maybe if she needs a new roof on the house, or new appliances, or needs to renovate, or maybe the carrying costs of a seasonal vacation home have increased, which she may have inherited, and she can't afford to keep it without significant financial assistance. Her co-trustees, being the children of the first marriage, on the other hand, have an interest in preserving as much of the capital as possible, since that's what they stand to inherit. And maybe they resent having to wait until their stepmother dies to finally receive their inheritance from their father's estate. It makes for a difficult relationship, and it can spring off in many different kinds of disputes. The takeaway message is that you can't assume that people who have no independent bond with one another will continue to get along simply because they had a common tie in you. Now, what happens if you throw your family business into the mix? Well, let's imagine that you've done an estate freeze, like Ali and Brian talked about earlier this morning, and the estate now holds, let's say, the preference shares, which get transferred to the spousal trust. Alternatively, there are concerns that apply to common shares that are being held in a family trust, which you might also see in an estate freeze scenario. In this case, we don't need to consider blended families necessarily to spot some of the potential pitfalls which can crop up when corporate shares are held in a trust structure. One of the more fundamental concerns is whether the trustees can even hold on to the shares. Now, this isn't normally a problem when the trustees hold a majority interest in the company. But what about when the trustees hold a minority interest? First of all, there are a couple of considerations that come into play. The trustee has no power to control the board or affect the decisions of the directors. They have a limited ability to supervise the business. They have limited access to financial information. If they're a minority shareholder, they don't have the ability to appoint themselves to the board, and therefore have limited access to financial information about the company. The shares that they hold are probably illiquid, as they are oftentimes for a privately held corporation. And the trustees are usually not able to assess the current or potential value of the shares with respect to income stream and capital growth. So if you had expected those shares to generate income, an income stream for your spouse, the spouse who survived you, it's difficult without having financial information for your trustees to assess what kind of future income is possible. Additionally, the trustees may have fiduciary obligations to sell the shares, which may be subject to a discount for the minority interest. Shares, after all, are an asset of the estate. They're an investment, and estate trustees are required to invest estate assets in a way that is different from how you might invest your own personal assets. You have to think about the well-being of the beneficiaries, and you may in fact have a fiduciary obligation to get rid of those shares because they are so unpredictable and because they have so little control over the corporation. So at the end of this analysis, you can see that in some cases it may be better to sell those shares during your lifetime rather than to saddle your estate trustees with that problem. Now, assuming that the trustees hold all of the shares of or a controlling interest in the corporation, it's important also to consider what obligations they'll have in relation to the management of that company. So if you are leaving your family business in your estate and you're expecting your estate trustees, whoever they may be, to manage that business, there are questions that come up, such as, do they have an obligation to appoint themselves as directors of the company? What if they have no business experience? What if they have no experience in that particular business, in that particular industry? Or if they have their own lives or live far away, and as such, they're not suitable to be corporate directors. The question is, can they delegate their duties and appoint a nominee director? If they appoint a nominee director, what level of supervision is required for that nominee? And there have been cases, there was one very well-known one, where the nominee director, the elderly surviving spouse, was not sophisticated enough to be involved in and manage the business, and appointed a nominee. I think it might have been an accountant, and that accountant ended up absconding with money from the company. And it was because of the lack of oversight by the estate trustees. So it's an important issue to consider. What about sharing information? I mentioned about how if you're a minority shareholder, you may not have access to all the financial information about the company, but what about if you appoint a nominee? Is that nominee required to share information about the company with you? And are there any privacy concerns or any confidentiality concerns about sharing that financial information with someone who's not a director of the company? These are all issues that have to be considered while you're doing your planning. I can tell you that many disputes that I see grow out of distrust and lack of communication, and not sharing information about the company outside of the circle of directors and with other family members who may have an interest in the trust that's holding these corporate shares can give rise to disputes, just because it can give rise to suspicion and lack of communication. This happens particularly where you have a child who has been involved in the business for a large part of their lives, and another child or more than one children who are not involved in the business and never really fully understood what was going on in the business. All of a sudden, when their father or mother who was involved in the business and managing it during their lifetime, when they're no longer around, it can become there can become this black hole of information where the other siblings who are not involved don't really understand what's going on and suspect the worst. And I can tell you, just as a simple example, in the last 6 months, I've dealt with 3 cases where family members or related parties have gotten into a dispute over a suspicion that someone was doing something wrong in the management of the estate and the family business. And in fact, there was no misconduct at all. In each of those cases, the dispute arose because one party wasn't getting information and suspected the worst. So it's certainly a prevalent problem. Coming back to our example of trustees who control trusts which hold shares of the family business, another question that comes up is how the trustees, who are also acting as corporate directors, are required to vote. Do they have to vote in the best interests of the trust beneficiaries or of the corporation? Should they favor the second wife and try to generate as much income as they can? Or should they favor the capital beneficiaries and try to grow the capital, the equity of the business as much as they can? There was a very interesting case here in Ontario a number of years ago where the patriarch of the family had amassed a portfolio of real estate properties, income-producing properties, and when he died, his children were left as trustees and therefore directors of the company. and they were entitled to the income of the company, and their children, the patriarch's grandchildren, were entitled to the capital. Well, the children, and I'm going to simplify this a bit in the interest of time, the children ended up mortgaging a lot of these properties to a very significant extent. They said that they were mortgaging the properties in order to improve the quality of the units and generate more income. The children generation, they were all adults, the grandchildren generation rather, they were all adults in their own right. They were concerned because all they were looking to inherit was a pile of debt, a lot of mortgaged properties. So these are all considerations that can be taken into account when you're doing your initial estate planning, if you turn your mind to how the company may be run going forward. And the takeaway from this discussion is that if you're going to use a trust structure to hold corporate shares, you need to be realistic about the relationships between the trustees and their ability to work together. And you have to consider what's going to happen to the company and its assets after you are no longer involved. And this brings me to my third and final concern, which is the income expectations on the business. Many business owners want their business to continue generating income after their death to support their surviving spouse's lifestyle, and for the most part, that plan can work. There are situations, however, which lend themselves to difficulties on that front. For example, and just drawing from my own experience, I worked some years ago with a widow whose husband was involved in property development, and they enjoyed a very comfortable life together during his lifetime until his untimely death. His various development projects were held in single-purpose companies, and the shares of those companies fell into a trust under his will. Unfortunately, some of those companies were joint ventures with his brother, who had died a short while earlier, and while he and his brother got along very well, their families didn't get along quite as much. And when the brother died, his wife and children started a number of lawsuits over alleged mismanagement in these joint venture companies. And some of those, and just to complicate matters, some of the projects that he was involved in were still at the early stages of development, and in some cases just vacant land with development plans. So as a result, the companies were either tied up in litigation or generating no income at all because they hadn't been developed yet. And the widow who I was working with had great difficulty in maintaining her lifestyle as her husband had wanted her to, because there simply wasn't liquidity in the estate. And I do see these sorts of liquidity problems a fair bit in my practice. This is just one example. Another example of how this can arise is where the business owner is a key man and holds the critical relationships with vendors and suppliers. And when the key man dies, the business it may be viable, but simply inserting a trustee to run the business isn't enough to keep it alive. You need those relationships. And there are a number of industries which are dependent on those personal relationships. So I know that all I've done is talk about problems, and I've probably just alerted many of you to futility in succession planning, but of course that's not my intention, and that's not true. The good news, of course, is that all these problems are manageable. All the problems that I talked about could have been solved with proper planning in advance and with proper management. Of course, not all problems can be solved, and disputes are bound to arise. And if you've turned your mind to these problems in advance and you work with experienced professionals like the ones who you've met here today, you can avoid many of these pitfalls that I've talked about. My goal in alerting you to these problems has just been to raise the awareness of these issues, because thinking about them now, when you can do something about them, will often alleviate that problem down the road, because there are lots of solutions to these problems. And if, of course, you can't avoid the problems, then you have my number and you know how to reach me. So that's all I have to say. And what I'm going to do now is give you, in just a couple of minutes before I turn it over to Adam Minsky, I'm going to give you just a little teaser on what to expect going forward for next week. You will be getting at the end of the second day a survey, which I hope you'll complete, letting us know what you liked, what you didn't like, what you'd like to see in future sessions. The idea behind creating this program was to create an annual program which we could build on. And as I said at the beginning, if we can bring you together in person, which I'm hoping we can do in the very near future, then we'll have a very much more interactive session with much more detail and in-depth coverage of a lot of these issues. What you're going to hear next week, next Tuesday, is you'll hear from a life transition coach and an experienced estate planner about how to plan for non-income earning spouse when the primary income earner dies first. You're also going to hear about how to structure a philanthropic gift to take advantage of tax benefits and get family members across generations involved in philanthropy. And you'll hear tips on using insurance strategically in your business succession plan. And we also have Sarah Lefton, a Senior Vice President and Campaign Director at UJA, and a very inspiring speaker who's going to give you a very short snapshot into the work that UJA does and the impact it has on the community. So I hope you'll join us next Tuesday. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam Minsky. Adam is the President and CEO of UJA Federation of Greater Toronto, and I will ask him to say a few words to wrap up today. And you'll have to unmute. There you go.
Thanks, Eric. Good morning, everyone. You know, although this morning's session focused mainly on business succession, I couldn't help but think about how many of the same topics apply to philanthropic succession planning. I know that philanthropy is a component of your next session on September 22nd. So as I listened to the insights from today and applied them to the idea of philanthropic succession, my mind kept thinking about two incredibly special people who many of you on this webinar will know and miss dearly as I do, Honey and Barry Sherman. You know, I'm fortunate because I have the privilege of continuing to work on their philanthropic legacy thanks to the fact that their two Toronto-based kids have prioritized perpetuating their parents' commitment to exceptional generosity. And both of them have taught me a great deal about what's important in philanthropic succession. You know, one of the greatest privileges of working at UJA is the opportunity to learn from many of our community's most philanthropic individuals about their hopes and dreams for the Jewish people. Conversations usually begin with values upon which businesses or careers are built, and then they broaden to apply those same values to the philanthropic betterment of our community. I had the privilege of having those kinds of really meaningful conversations with both Honey and Barry. There's a special connection that's formed when you have a conversation about a person's vision for a better future. You discover a beautiful side to them that often too few people know. I've come to appreciate through my work with Honey and Barry's kids that those conversations that are so meaningful to a community professional like me are many, many times more powerful when they happen between parents and their children and their grandchildren. When we talk about succession, what we're talking about is much more than just transmitting philanthropic intentions or project goals. We're ultimately transmitting to our children our passions and aspirations for the community and for the world around us. Tragically, as we all know, we lost Honey and Barry far too soon. Their kids knew so much about their parents, but they hadn't yet had the opportunity to explore together the beauty and the wisdom that underpinned their parents' philanthropy. The gap in knowledge taught me that there is something equal in power to important multi-generational conversations. Philanthropic succession planning also requires that parents model the behavior they want children and grandchildren to emulate. Through our philanthropic actions, we are actively teaching our ideals and priorities. I'm awed at the way that Honey and Barry's adult children have picked up the mantle for the family. They're very involved in UJA and the causes that were dear to their parents and are quickly becoming philanthropic leaders in their own right. They learned by watching their parents, and today our community is the beneficiary of the wisdom shared through Honey and Barry's philanthropic deeds. My hope is that you found today's session incredibly valuable in helping you navigate these important conversations with your loved ones, whether about business or philanthropy, or in helping your clients do the same. And ultimately, I wish for all of you to share your own hopes and dreams for the future with your children and grandchildren. I want to thank all of today's presenters, Eric Hofstein, Ali Spinner, Brian Cohen, Mark Halpern, Ellie Shochet, and the amazing Browns, David, Golda, and Sarah. And a very special thank you to Janice Benatar and Brett Henry for their incredible work in organizing today's event. Thank you all, and I wish you all a Shana Tova, Chag Sameach, and we look forward to seeing you on the 22nd for the second part of this series. Have a good morning.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate those comments. And for the rest of you who are still on the line, I wanted to let you know David Brown, who wasn't able to share his comments with us, is going to provide his written comments in the materials that we're going to circulate to all of the attendees. So you will get a chance to hear what he had to say. And I can tell you, knowing, having heard what his comments beforehand, I think they're going to be very valuable, and I think they will be very much appreciated. So thank you, David, for doing that. And with that, for those of you celebrating Rosh Hashanah on the weekend, I wish you a Shana Tova. With that, I hope to see you all next week. Thank you.